All right, so this is going to be the second installment in this series on the Byzantine Empire, and in this video, we're just going to continue on. We're just going to continue on where we left off at in the last video, where we talked about the legendary progenitor of the Byzantine Empire, Constantine the Great, as well as some of his descendants like his son Constantius II, and then the Valentinian Emperor Valens. And then we also took a look at the Theodosian emperors like Arcadius, Theodosius I, who was his father, and then Honorius, who was his brother. And then lastly, we were able to get a glimpse at what the Emperor Zeno from the Leonid dynasty looked like, with him being stated as a man who was quote-unquote black of skin. So I've already been able to firmly establish the ethnicity of the Byzantine emperors as being so-called black men. And so we're just going to continue on with that by first looking at arguably the most important dynasty of the Byzantine Age's history. This dynasty was known as the Justinian dynasty, and its first emperor was a man by the name of Justin I. And from Justin I, we see his nephew, who was originally known as Peter Sabatius, but is famously known in history as Justinian I. And with Justinian I, we're going to take a different approach from my previous videos in order to see what he truly looked like, and we're going to look at a lot of the coins that were minted of him during his lifetime. So let's take a look at some of those. So this first coin of Justinian I depicts him as being one of the first Roman emperors to have held the quote-unquote globus cruciger, which is something we are going to see a lot of during our investigation into the medieval time period. But anyway, when we look at this coin right here of Justinian I, we can see the clear so-called black features in his face. There really isn't that much speculation or conjecture that needs to be taken about this coin because of how obvious it is that this coin again depicts Justinian I as a so-called black man. And I guarantee you that if this was not a coin that was said to depict the face of Justinian I, like say I stated that this coin depicted a king from the Dahomean Empire in Benin, or the Ashanti Empire, or even the Aksumite Empire from East Africa, there will be no question that this was indeed depicting a so-called black African king or emperor. But since this is Justinian I, of course there are going to be some rather enraged, angry trolls of a certain demographic that have came into my comments that I've noticed to try and disapprove that Justinian I was a so-called black man, as it obviously depicts him to be on this coin right here. But it really doesn't matter, because for those of us who aren't biased towards one side of the argument, we can clearly see what reality is, which is that Justinian I was a so-called black man as he's depicted on this coin. So, but let's just look at another coin of Justinian I. So now this second depiction of Justinian I is actually a medallion of his that was made to commemorate the reconquest of northern Africa that was previously occupied by a Germanic tribe known as the Vandals, who had occupied North Africa, particularly the capital of North Africa, which was Carthage at the time, since about 439 CE. And they were even able to spread their rule out to other areas as well, like Sardinia, Corisca, and a bevy of other areas as well. But what compelled Justinian to reconquer this region was the persecution that adherents to the Catholic faith had to face, while there was a ruler who was a strict adherent to the teaching of the Egyptian bishop that I talked about in my last video, Arius, who was the establisher of the theological philosophy known as Arianism. But so Justinian launched an attempt at a reconquest in 533 AD, first by attacking the city of Tripolitania in Libya, and in the same year, a Vandal king named Hildek, who had been an ally of the Byzantines and had gone as far as to end the persecution of Catholics in Vandal territories, was deposed in favor of his eventual successor, who was named Guilimir in 530 AD. And as an attempt to show a level of salutation towards Hildek, Justinian assisted him in his attempts to subvert Guilimir and regain his place as king, while also trying to reestablish the control of Rome that Rome once had over North Africa. But soon after, one of Justinian's greatest military leaders, Belisarius, led an armed force of ships into the Aegean, going from Sicily to Africa. And after a series of battles had ensued, Belisarius eventually was able to supplant the Vandal king Guilimir in the winter of 534 AD, and North Africa was once again in the hands of the Roman Empire. But I said all that to say that that this is what this medallion was minted for. It was minted to commemorate the regaining of North Africa that was, of course, led and commissioned by Justinian the First. But just look at this medallion right here. Again, the medallion clearly shows Justinian the First to have been a so-called black man. Okay, this looks like another one of those coins or medallions that if it read African king from Nigeria or something like that instead of Justinian the First of the Byzantine Empire, people would have no doubt that this was indeed a black man or even a so-called black African man. And so when we take a look at other coins of Justinian the First, like this one right here, which looks like an older version of the first coin that I showed, but nevertheless, you can still see the clear, distinct so-called black features in this man's face. I mean, it's obvious. And then this coin right here, once again, shows Justinian the First to have had so-called black features as well. And then this coin's excavation was actually documented, I believe. I believe it was found in South India or Southern India around like the late 2000s, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, we can see that the original coins of Justinian the First attribute him to have had black features. Okay, and then this is a seal of Justinian the First, and even though it is a bit more difficult to see his facial features, you can still see that it displays a man who had so-called black features. And then these coins and medallions, and even this seal right here, were created in and around Justinian's lifetime. Okay, so please keep that in mind. And then here is one last seal that depicts the face of Justinian the First. Again, it is a bit hard to see the facial features, but when you look close enough, you can still see the so-called black features. Okay, so these coins and medallions and even seals can be deemed as completely accurate portrayals of what Justinian the First looked like, right? But just like in my last video where I showed a plethora of icons that originally depicted Constantine and his mother Helena, and even other figures like Arcadius and his brother and father Honorius and Theodosius, there have been attempts to try and recreate the image of Justinian the First on his coins, but just like the other recreated icons from my last video, they completely changed the face of Justinian the First to look like this right here. Now this image of Justinian the First is meant to fall in line with the fake mosaic image of Justinian the First that shows him as a Caucasian man. But when we compare these two images to a coin that was actually made during Justinian's lifetime and were even commissioned to be made by Justinian himself, we can see the clear, distinct difference in how Justinian and the people who originally struck these coins depicted him to look like, versus how the modern day interpretation of Justinian looks like today. Okay, so these are clearly two different, distinct people. I mean, come on now. But the point is that Justinian the First, just like Constantine and his other successors and the other successors of his that I've already shown, were originally depicted as so-called black men. Okay, because that is what they were, or that is what Justinian the First was. And we can see this even more as we go down and look at some of his family members, Justinian the First family members, like his successor slash nephew Justin the Second, who, like his uncle, was originally depicted clearly as a so-called black man, as we can clearly see by looking at this gold solidus coin of him. And just like his uncle, the black features are obvious and right in your face. You can see the clear, broad, flat nose, and then the thick lips that Justin the Second had on this coin. And then here's another coin that shows Justin the Second's face. And once again, you can see the features of a black man that are displayed. And then here is one last coin that I'll show of Justin the Second. And again, clearly he was depicted as a so-called black man. And now as we move down to his successor, Tiberius the Second, and look at his coin, this also clearly depicts him as a black man as well, with obvious negroid features. Wide nose, thick lips. You can see it clearly right here. And then we can go down the line to his successor and son-in-law, who before he became emperor of the Byzantine Empire, he was a very successful military general known formally as Maurice, but then once he became emperor, he changed his name and was now called Maurice Tiberius. Okay, now that name Maurice in and of itself is a name that denotes somebody who has so-called black lineage, because it quite literally means and is an alteration of the word quote-unquote Moor, which was a word that we're going to see a lot of historical figures being called all throughout the medieval time period, as well as in this series as well. But For those of you who don't know, the word Moor was a word that from the medieval time period down to the Renaissance time period during Shakespeare's era was just a synonym for a so-called black person. And this is where we see figures like Saint Maurice, quote unquote Saint Maurice, pop up, right? Saint Maurice, for those of you who don't know, was a character that was martyred into a saint after the Roman Emperor Maximian had ordered Saint Maurice and the members of his quote unquote Theban legion to be killed after they refused to kill other Christians by the orders of Maximian. And so most historians use this story of piety that was displayed by Saint Maurice as a way to explain away a lot of statues, monuments, and even manuscripts that depict knights as so-called black men. And just me personally, I believe that it is a possibility that Saint Maurice never existed and was never a real person in the first place, and that they just use him to once again cover up the fact that most of the knights during the medieval time period were indeed so-called black men. Uh, Um, excuse me. Especially some of the more notable ones in history, like William Marshall and Hugh de Paynes, the legendary Swan Knight, who was the ancestor of one of the most famous Crusader knights, Godfrey de Bouillon, and so on and so forth. But we'll be that will be another story for another day when I cover the knights of the medieval time period in conjunction with the movie The Black Knight starring Martin Lawrence, because there is a lot of symbolism in that movie that is supposed to act as a mockery towards the so-called black man and his blatant ignorance towards his real history. But anyway, getting back to Emperor Maurice, his name was given to him to indicate that he was indeed a so-called black man. But let's just look up what the name Maurice meant just to confirm that this is indeed true. So now let's look at etymology.com first to see what this name Maurice means, so that we can get a better understanding of why Saint Maurice was named was given this name. So let's just read this first. So it says masculine proper name from French Maurice, from Latin Martius, from Latin Maurus, inhabitant of Mauritania, Moor, see Moor. Okay, so we can see here where it says see Moor because the name Maurice derives from the term Moor. So now let's take a look at what this term Moor meant according to this website's definition of the word. So now let's read this website's definition of the word Moor. And we're not going to read all of this. We're just going to mainly take a look at what it says in the second paragraph. So let's start where it says also applied. So also applied to the Arabic conquerors of Spain, being a dark people in relation to Europeans. Their name in the Middle Ages was a synonym for Negro. Okay, so once again, the word Moor during the medieval time period meant a so-called Negro or a so-called black person. Really this word goes all the way back to the ancient Latin language, where the word moros was used to describe people of color. Case in point, the Roman poet Claudian called the Picts of Scotland moroses, which translates to Moors because he was basically stating that the Picts were so-called black people. But again, that's another story for another day. But anyway, we see here in this first definition of the name Maurice, the name was derived of Moor, which meant somebody who was a dark-skinned person or a so-called black person. Okay, but let's take a look at a few more definitions of the name Maurice. So now this is a dictionary of first names, and so let's see what this book has to say about the name Maurice. So from the Latin name Morcius, Morcius, a derivative of Morus, a byname meaning Moor, i.e. dark, swarthy, born by, among others, an early Byzantine emperor, referring to, of course, the emperor we're talking about right now, the Emperor Maurice. And then it goes on to say that the name was introduced into Britain by the Normans and was popular during their time period, or the Middle English time period, and it went out of vogue in and around the 17th century into the 19th century. And you know what? And you want to know why that is? It's because that was around the time period when so-called blacks became less and less of a factor in Europe, and so names that were meant to indicate that someone had dark skin or was so-called black started to go out of style because they just didn't apply to the people who were starting to take over Europe at the time. But you see, it says the name was frequent amongst the Normans because the Normans, quiet as kept, were also so-called black themselves. And they will be a very essential group of people that I will speak about as I continue with my series on the medieval time period, particularly the medieval England. But anyway, we see here that the name Morris was a name that means dark and swarthy, right? and it even makes an allusion to the fact that the Emperor Maurice was one of the first people to be given this name. So once again, the name Maurice was given to Emperor Maurice because he was a so-called black man. So now let's take a look at one more source that will give us an idea of what the name Maurice means. So now let's look at this book that explains the origins and definitions of familial surnames, and we're going to look at the name Morris. So let's read what this entry says. So Moorish looking, swarthy, or from personal name Maurice, which has the same meaning. Okay, so again, the name Maurice, which according to this entry means Moorish looking, right? We just read that Moor during the Middle Ages meant a so-called black man or a Negro. And then it also says it meant swarthy, which is a word that I went over in depth to a degree in my last video. And it's going to be a word that we'll see quite frequently throughout this series. And I even told you guys that swarthy just simply meant someone who could be classified as so-called black, right? But yes, again, the name Maurice meant somebody, particularly a male who was black. And, the coat of arms for this name, Morris, even confirms this to be true because it usually depicts three so-called black men within the middle of the crest. And before someone comes on here and says that these three quote-unquote Moors heads were just conquered Muslim Moors from the Crusades, even though allegedly those same people will claim that the Moors weren't even black, but whatever. But for those of you who but for the people who claim that this is true, or that claim this to be true, please keep in mind that Morris and Maurice, they please keep in mind what Morris and Maurice mean as surnames, and then refer back to this crest, and it will become extremely obvious why the family crest for the surname Morris has three black men in the center. But anyway, this is even more confirmation that Maurice was indeed a black man. The Emperor Maurice of the Byzantine Empire was indeed a so-called black man. But if that is not enough, let's look at it. Let's look at a description of Maurice that was given by a historian, from the 19th century, which of course is nowhere near when Emperor Maurice would have lived. But it will reveal how even amongst the cognoscenti of scholarship, they know that figures like Emperor Maurice were indeed so-called black men or so-called black. So let's take a look at a description of Maurice real quick. Okay, so we're going to start around page 36 in this book. So let's read. So the Emperor Maurice, a brave but swarthy and thick-lipped soldier, lost his popularity. Now listen to this real quick. The people found a Negro slave who bore a striking resemblance to the sovereign, talking about the Emperor Maurice. Okay, so this historian right here, I believe his name was Edwin Augustus, even alludes to the fact that the Emperor Maurice was indeed a black man. And I believe this novel is somewhat historical fiction, but nevertheless, the man does include real, actual historical information in it, including the fact that Maurice was indeed a so-called black man, as we've already seen, and as I've already been able to prove. Okay, the historian refers to him as swarthy. What does the name Maurice mean? We saw that it meant dark and swarthy, right? Just like the name Morris did as well. So again, this guy was obviously in the know about the real ethnic origins of Emperor Maurice Tiberius. And so when we look at some of the coins that depict the Emperor Maurice, we can clearly see that they depicted him as a so-called black man with the same features that this author describes him with. In this coin, you can see the thick lips that Maurice was described having, along with the flat nose of a so-called black man, which is why the author of the book that I just read from, his name was once again Edwin Augustus, stated that there was a Negro slave who bore a striking resemblance to the Emperor Maurice, meaning he looked just like him, right? And we can see why that would be, why a Negro would bear a striking resemblance to the Emperor Maurice, because I mean this obviously depicts a so-called black man on this coin. And then this second coin right here again shows Maurice with thick lips. You can't really see the nose that well, but it does in fact show Maurice with a flat nose as well. When you look at it closely, I'll give you guys a couple seconds to look at it real quick. And then lastly, we have this coin right here, again showing him to be a so-called black man. Okay, so we pretty much get the point. All of these emperors in the famed Justinian dynasty, which was once again arguably the greatest and most essential dynasty in the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Empire in general, they were all so-called black men. It should be obvious by now. So now let's look down the line at some more Byzantine emperors that were clearly depicted as so-called black. Okay, so this emperor that I wanted to talk about is or was named Constans II, and he was the son of another emperor who was named Constantine III. And in this icon right here, we can clearly see that Constans II is depicted as a man of color, and in this icon, Constans is ordering the execution of a saint that is still remembered to this day as one of the martyred saints of Christendom. His name was Saint Maximus or Saint Maximus, and Constantine II ordered his exile due to his support of a theory in Christendom circles that still is discussed to this day, pertaining to the nature and will of Christ. Um, the theory that Saint Maximus was a proponent of was called monothelitism, and these different theories that the early churches came up with about Christ and his divinity are something that I will talk about more on my biblical channel, because there's a lot of them and they can get kind of convoluted. But the short summary of this theory is that Christ had two natures, which was him being fully divine and fully human at the same time, but only having one will. And this ran contrary to the opposing theory, which was known as dilothelitism, which states that since Christ had two natures, he also had to have two wills that were both divine and human. And I'll just leave it at that for right now, because like I said, this is something that I'll explain in more depth later on my biblical channel. But anyway, but the monothelitism theory became even more fervent when the predecessor of Constans II, who was named Heraclius, issued the edict that became known as the ex thesis, or the statement of faith. And a controversy became so palpable that Constans II had to step in and create an edict in 648 called Typos, which forbade the discussion of the question in and of itself. And so this edict was condemned by the Pope at the time, who was Pope Martin I, which led Constans II to exile him and Saint Maximus, who was a supporter of Pope Martin I. And they were also exiled in the eastern region of the Black Sea, which is ultimately where he died, where both of those people died. But yeah, that's the backstory of what's going on in this icon. But the main component that we can see clearly is that both Constans II and Saint Maximus were depicted as so-called black men, clearly. And an even older depiction of this conflict is portrayed in the Manassas Byzantine Chronicle, and in this manuscript, where Constans is depicted on the far left with the crown atop his head, you can see that his skin is relatively dark brown. Even though the face has been blotted out, you can still see the skin color on his hand, even though it's a bit, and then a little bit on his face too. So once again, yet another Byzantine emperor that was depicted as a so-called black man. And so now I want to move forward and I want to move forward a little bit and take a look at another emperor who was named Michael III, who during his reign restored the advent of icons that were previously outlawed by another Byzantine emperor by the name of Leo III Isaurian. And well, it was actually his mother, Theodora, who was the main one that brought the practice of venerating icons back into practice. And for a lot of his reign, his family members were the main ones who made decisions in his name due to him being very young when he inherited the throne. His mother, Theodora, was made Michael III's regent after his father, who was the previous emperor, Theophilos, if I'm not mistaken, had died. And along with the chief minister named Theo Kixtos, if I'm not mistaken, he was also meant to act as a regent in Michael III's name. So a lot of decisions were not primarily made by Michael III during the earlier years of his reign, at least not until he overthrew his mother and Theokstos in 855 AD. And ultimately, he killed Theokstos and banished his mother to a monastery. But even after this had been done, another one of his family members had taken the mantle as regent and was still running the show behind the scenes, while Michael III was acting as the figurehead for his uncle Bardas. Bardas was the one who assassinated Theokstos, who was his brother-in-law, in order to take the mantle of co-regent alongside his nephew, Michael III. And so Michael III had Bardas removed as well, and in and around 865, and he enjoyed absolute rule until his assassination in 867 AD. So Michael III wasn't the greatest ruler of the Byzantine age, and he certainly wasn't the most memorable, even within his own time period on the throne. Because his mother Theodora and Theokstos were far more impactful overall than him as regents. But the main reason why I wanted to reference Michael III is because of as I already stated, reinvigoration of icons being produced within the Byzantine Empire during his reign, even though he wasn't the one who was primarily responsible for it. It still occurred during his reign under the auspice of his mother, Theodora. And to commemorate this event, she created a series of icons that depicted herself and Michael III that tell a lot about what they truly looked like. So let's take a look at some of those real quick. Okay, so this first icon is a relatively famous one that became known as the Triumph of the Orthodoxy, which once again was meant to commemorate the reinstallation of venerating icons within the Byzantine Empire. And just by looking at this icon right here, we can clearly see that there are four priests standing to the right, and then in the very middle is the Mother Mary and Christ, and at the left, the two figures that are depicted are Theodora and Michael III. And as we can clearly see without much speculation, both Theodora and Michael III are portrayed as so-called black people. Now, based off of a lot of the comments I saw in my last video, a lot of people, of course, not the ones who are subscribed to the channel, but a lot of people stated that the icons that I showed of Constantine and Helena had just gotten darkened over time due to age or due to being in a hot, humid church next to a bevy of candles, which caused a lot of the original paint to melt and become darker or something. But let's just read something real quick here to see if that assertion is indeed true. So let's read this entry real quick. Let's read this entry real quick here that will shed a little light on what the original complexion of the Mother Mary was in Byzantine art. So I'll start where it states the illuminators. So the illuminators of the Middle Ages represent Christ in black drapery when wrestling against the genius of evil. And the Virgin Mary, listen to this, often has a black complexion on paintings of the 12th century, which pertain to Byzantine art. Okay, so it says right here that the illuminators of the Middle Ages originally painted and depicted the image of the Mother Mary with a black complexion originally. Okay. It says in Byzantine art that was made from the 12th century, Mary was originally painted with a black skin color. So again, no, these icons didn't get darker over time due to the colors melting into a black color. Again, like I stated in my last video, if the theory that the people that are being depicted in these icons just got dark over time was true, then how come literally no other element in the icon grew dark along with the people who are being depicted? The red robes that Theodora and Michael III are wearing are still red. How come those didn't get dark over time? I mean, shit, when you look at the robes that the three saints in the corner have on, those are colored dark brown, which is the same as their skin. But would anybody question whether or not the robes were the actual color, that would anybody question whether or not the color of their robes were the actual color that the robes originally had? I mean, you can look down to today and see Catholic friars that have the same exact dark brown colored robes on that these saints have on in this icon. And just in general, this was the color of the vestments that most people wore during the quote unquote biblical time period. So just like the robes were originally painted dark brown, so it is for the faces of these individuals, okay? The skin color that was painted of these individuals was originally a dark brown or black color. So Theodora and Michael III were depicted with dark brown skin or dark brown to black skin because they were indeed so-called black. And there's even a mural of Theodora that was painted by a Byzantine painter from the 13th or 14th century. I believe it depicts her as a woman of color as well. Okay, here it is right here. And again, this is from a Byzantine painter's point of view based off of what he knew the accurate historical depiction of Theodora was. So again, both Theodora and her son Michael III were so-called black. And so now let's talk about one more Byzantine emperor before I close out this video and move on to the third and final installment of this introduction into the medieval time period. Again, you guys, I'm getting you guys prepared for the things that we're about to see when I really get into the medieval time period. It's going to get more and more difficult for certain people to refute that so-called blacks ruled and were a prevalent force during the Middle Ages with the stuff that I'm going to be coming out with very soon. But anyway, let's move to the very last emperor that I want to talk about. And the first one I want to show is Constantine the Seventh, who had no relation to Constantine the Great. Byzantine emperors just like to name their children Constantine after, of course, the first Byzantine emperor ever, because they looked at that name as a show of great renown because of the reputation that Constantine had as a saint. and really Constantine, who was the originator of the vast majority of the tenets that the Byzantine Empire followed. But anyway, let's take a look at Constantine the Seventh. So this depiction of Constantine the Seventh is of him on his deathbed, and clearly he's depicted as a so-called black man with dark brown skin. And with these manuscripts, there are a bevy of fake replicas with whitened faces of figures like Constantine the Seventh, and you can see a little bit of that in this manuscript right here, where the bishops behind Constantine the Seventh and the people to his left have whitened faces with black or brown paint behind the whitish, yellowish paint. The only one who seems to retain the original coloring of their face is Constantine the Seventh. And so either the black or brown paint was painted over, or it deteriorated over time. But you can clearly see that the faces originally were supposed to be brown or black, like Constantine the Seventh's face right here. And we're going to see an example of how the faces of some of these emperors get whitened in manuscript paintings in the next video. But that will conclude this video. And again, the next video will be the last of this series. And then after this series, we will take a deep dive into how the history of the so-called black presence during the medieval time period has been gradually erased over the years. So that will be what's coming up. So look out for those.